Man rescues a crying bear from a trap. What the bear does next will leave you stunned. The wind whispered through the towering pines, carrying the scent of damp earth and the crisp bite of the approaching winter. Ethan Walker adjusted the strap of his rifle, though he had no intention of using it, and trudged along the narrow trail leading deeper into the Montana wilderness. The land stretched vast and unyielding around him, untouched except for the occasional imprint of an elk's hooves or the soft indentation left by a rabbit's hurried escape. His breath misted in front of him as he exhaled, watching the way it curled and dissolved into the air. It was a peaceful day, silent in a way only the wilderness could be, until that silence was shattered by a sound that made him stop in his tracks. A deep, guttural growl rolled through the trees, followed by a sharp, pained cry that sent a ripple of unease down Ethan's spine. He scanned the undergrowth, his trained eyes catching the frantic rustling of a creature in distress. Moving with careful steps, he followed the noise, his heart pounding a little harder with each passing second. His boots crunched over frost-kissed leaves as he pushed past low-hanging branches, his mind already forming possibilities of what he might find. A wounded deer, a trapped coyote, perhaps even a wolf caught in some hunter's illegal snare. But what he found made him freeze completely. A massive black bear lay on its side, its thick fur bristling with tension as it struggled against the cruel grip of a steel trap. The sharp teeth of the metal had sunk deep into its front paw, blood seeping into the frozen ground beneath it. The bear's breath came heavy, visible puffs of warm air against the cold, and its dark eyes gleamed with a mixture of pain and weariness. Ethan knew immediately that he was in a dangerous situation. A cornered animal, especially one as powerful as a bear, was unpredictable. He had no doubt that if he made the wrong move, it could be the last mistake he ever made. But he also knew he couldn't walk away. Slowly, Ethan set his rifle against a nearby stump, keeping his hands visible. "Easy, big guy," he murmured, his voice steady but low. He crouched a safe distance away, assessing the trap. It was an older model, likely one set by poachers who had no regard for regulations. The mechanism was rusted, its jagged teeth designed to hold fast, ensuring that anything caught in its grasp wouldn't escape. He cursed under his breath. The bear let out a low, warning growl, its muscles tensing as Ethan inched closer. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said. Keeping his tone calm and measured, he reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a small folding knife. The bear's ears flicked forward, nostrils flaring as it watched him with unwavering intensity. Every instinct screamed at Ethan to turn back, to leave this to nature, but something about the way the bear remained still, despite its pain, made him stay. It was as if, on some primal level, it understood that he was not the enemy. Ethan worked quickly, fingers numb from the cold as he pried at the trap's release mechanism. The bear let out a deep grunt, shifting slightly, and Ethan's heart nearly stopped when its immense body twitched in response to his movements. He froze, watching, waiting. The moment stretched, filled only with the bear's labored breathing and the rustling of trees in the wind. Then, with a final sharp press, the trap gave way, the metal jaws snapping open with a loud metallic clang. The bear let out a pained grunt, yanking its injured paw back. Blood dripped onto the snow, stark and vivid against the white. Ethan remained still, watching as the animal lifted its massive head to meet his gaze. There was no immediate lunge, no furious attack, only that same lingering intensity. A deep, unspoken understanding seemed to pass between them, something ancient and wild. Then, without another sound, the bear turned and lumbered off into the trees, vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. Ethan exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He sat back on his heels, staring at the empty space where the bear had been. His pulse was still hammering, adrenaline still thrumming through his veins, but the moment had passed. He glanced at the trap, its blood-stained teeth glinting dully in the weak afternoon light. He would have to report this, make sure no more were hidden in these woods. This was his land, his responsibility. As he gathered his rifle and stood, he felt a strange sense of unease settle in his gut. Not fear exactly, but something close to it. The bear had been watching him, not just in the way a wounded animal watches its surroundings for threats, but something else, something almost knowing. He shook the thought away and began the trek back to his cabin. That night, as the wind howled outside and the fire crackled in his stone hearth, Ethan found his thoughts returning to the bear. He wondered if it had managed to find shelter, if its wound would heal, if it would even survive the coming winter. The image of those dark, intelligent eyes stayed with him longer than he expected. He'd seen many animals in his time, but there was something different about this one. The following morning, with fresh snow blanketing the ground, Ethan stepped outside to check his traps and gather firewood. As he moved through the trees, something caught his eye. Just beyond the clearing, near the edge of the forest, a massive set of paw prints stood stark against the untouched snow. They were fresh, and they led straight to his cabin before veering back into the trees. Ethan stared at them for a long moment before exhaling slowly, a small, knowing smile tugging at the corner of his lips. He didn't need to follow them to know who they belonged to. Shadow was still out there. Ethan Walker woke to the crisp bite of winter seeping through the wooden walls of his cabin. The fire in the hearth had burned low, leaving only embers glowing faintly beneath the iron grate. He pulled his coat tighter around his frame and ran a calloused hand over his face, shaking off the last remnants of sleep. The dream still lingered, a heavy presence in his mind. The black bear's dark eyes, the way it had watched him, not with the wild unpredictability of an animal, but with something deeper, something that felt almost human. It wasn't fear, nor was it gratitude. It was recognition. Shaking his head, Ethan stood, stretching stiff limbs before stepping toward the window. Snow blanketed the ground in an unbroken expanse of white, save for the unmistakable imprints leading from the tree line to his cabin and back again. He had seen them yesterday, fresh and deliberate, but seeing them again after a night's snowfall confirmed what he had already suspected. Shadow was watching him. He pulled on his boots, the leather creaking with the movement, and stepped out onto the porch. The morning air was sharp, biting at his skin, but he had grown accustomed to the cold. The Montana wilderness had its own way of shaping a man, demanding resilience, patience, and a certain level of respect that only came with time. He followed the prints with his eyes, tracing their path toward the dense forest beyond. Shadow had come close enough that Ethan might have seen him had he woken in the night. The thought sent a ripple of unease through him. Not fear, Ethan had long since learned to push that aside, but something deeper, something that made his instincts hum with awareness. Gathering his rifle out of habit rather than necessity, he descended the steps and followed the tracks into the trees. The snow crunched beneath his boots, each step measured and deliberate. He moved as he had learned to in his years as a ranger, silent, watchful, a part of the land rather than an intruder upon it. The forest was quiet, save for the occasional snap of a branch under the weight of snow. He followed the trail deeper, past the frozen creek and through the pines, until the tracks came to an abrupt stop near a clearing. There, amid the untouched snow, was a dark stain. Blood. Ethan's breath left him in a slow exhale as he knelt, running a gloved hand over the frozen ground. The crimson stood stark against the white, and the sight of it sent a cold realization creeping through his veins. It was fresh. His eyes flicked up, scanning the tree line, searching for any sign of movement. Shadow had been here. The prints, deep and purposeful, suggested no sign of limping, but the blood told a different story. Was it his, or had he encountered something else? Ethan straightened, senses sharpening. Poachers. The thought coiled like a snake in his gut. He had seen the traps, dismantled them, but he knew better than to assume his work had scared them off. Men like that didn't stop because someone told them to. They stopped when they were forced to. He took a slow, steadying breath and moved forward, following the traces of blood leading deeper into the woods. The trail was faint, small droplets scattered across the snow, but it was enough. After several minutes, he found what he was looking for. Another trap, its iron jaws snapped shut on empty air, its mechanism smeared with fresh blood. Ethan's jaw tightened as he crouched, inspecting the crude device. It was the same as the one he had freed Shadow from, old but effective, the kind designed to maim rather than kill outright. Nearby, a few snapped branches and disturbed snow suggested a struggle. Shadow must have freed himself, but not without injury. A rustling in the distance made Ethan still, his fingers instinctively tightening around his rifle. He listened, every muscle coiled with anticipation. The sound was faint but deliberate, the careful steps of something large moving through the undergrowth. He turned his head slowly, scanning the area until he saw it, a shadow between the trees. The bear stood motionless, half obscured by the thick pines, its massive form blending with the darkness. Its breath curled into the cold air in slow, deliberate exhales. Shadow's dark eyes locked onto Ethan's, unblinking, unreadable. The distance between them was not far, close enough that Ethan could see the faint tremor in the bear's injured paw, the way he favored it slightly as he shifted his weight. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Ethan was the first to break the silence. "You're hurt," he murmured, his voice carrying across the space between them. Shadow did not react, did not so much as flinch at the sound. He simply stood there, watching, waiting. Ethan took a slow step forward, careful to keep his movements deliberate, non-threatening. "I can help," he continued, though he wasn't sure why he was speaking aloud. Shadow wasn't a pet. He wasn't domesticated. He was wild, untamed. But still, he listened. Another step. Shadow's ears flicked back, a warning. Ethan stopped, respecting the unspoken boundary. He knew he couldn't approach, not like this. Instead, he slowly lowered his rifle, setting it down in the snow beside him, a gesture of trust. The bear's nostrils flared, catching the scent of the man who had freed him once before. Something shifted in those dark eyes. Not fear, not aggression, but something Ethan could only describe as recognition. And then, as suddenly as he had appeared, Shadow turned. He moved with a grace that belied his size, disappearing into the trees, leaving only a trail of blood in his wake. Ethan remained still, heart hammering against his ribs. He knew what he had to do. If the poachers were still out here, if they were still laying traps, Shadow wouldn't be the only victim. The balance of this land was delicate, and men like them had no respect for it. Ethan had spent his life protecting these woods. He wasn't about to stop now. With renewed purpose, he retrieved his rifle and stood, his gaze fixed on the direction Shadow had gone. The bear had survived once. He would again. But Ethan wouldn't leave it to chance. He would find the poachers. And this time, there would be no warnings. Ethan moved swiftly through the forest, his breath coming in steady clouds of mist as he followed the faint trail of blood disappearing into the snow-covered undergrowth. The weight of his rifle was familiar in his hands, though he had no intention of using it unless absolutely necessary. The wilderness was his home, his sanctuary, and men like the ones he sought had no place in it. Poachers were a plague, disrupting the delicate balance of the land, taking what they wanted without regard for the lives they destroyed. Ethan had spent years protecting these woods, and he wasn't about to let them turn into a hunting ground for profit-driven killers. The tracks ahead were faint, but his experience made him keen-eyed, able to discern what most others would miss. He could tell by the spacing of the footprints that the men had moved carefully, likely aware that they weren't alone out here. They had been here before, and they weren't afraid of returning. That would change soon. He adjusted his grip on his rifle and pushed forward, senses sharpened, heart steady. Every sound in the forest had meaning: the distant call of a raven, the rustle of wind through the pines, the subtle shift of weight beneath the snow. He knew these sounds well, and that was why, when something broke the rhythm of nature's symphony, he noticed immediately. A branch snapped up ahead. Not from an animal, not from the wind. This was different. It was deliberate. Ethan stopped, lowering himself slightly, his pulse a steady drumbeat in his ears. He let the silence stretch, listening, waiting. And then there it was again. Footsteps. Slow, careful. Someone was moving just beyond the ridge, beyond his line of sight. He exhaled slowly, adjusting his stance as he crept forward, keeping close to the trees, every movement precise. As he neared the clearing, he caught sight of them. 3 figures clad in thick hunting gear, rifles slung across their backs, their breath misting in the cold. They were gathered near a cluster of pine trees, speaking in hushed tones, their voices carrying faintly through the still air. Ethan couldn't make out every word, but he heard enough. "That bear's still out here," one of them muttered, spitting onto the snow. "Saw fresh tracks this morning. Bastard must have chewed his way out of the trap." Another man, stockier, with a scar along his jaw, shook his head. "We should have finished the job then. You saw the size of him. Pelt like that'll fetch a fortune." The third, younger than the others, but with the same cold glint in his eyes, chuckled darkly. "Next time we won't miss." Ethan's hands tightened into fists. He had seen enough. These men weren't just careless hunters. They were predators, looking to kill not for sustenance, but for greed. And Shadow was their next target. Ethan stepped forward, making no effort to conceal his presence now. The crunch of snow beneath his boots made the men snap their heads up, hands moving instinctively toward their weapons. But Ethan was faster. He leveled his rifle in their direction, not aiming to kill, but making damn sure they knew he could if he wanted to. "You're trespassing," he said, his voice calm but firm, carrying across the clearing like a warning bell. "You've been setting illegal traps on protected land. That ends today." The scarred man narrowed his eyes, his jaw tightening. "And who the hell are you?" Ethan took another step forward. "Ethan Walker, former ranger of these woods. And you're about 3 seconds away from regretting every choice that led you here." The younger one sneered, but there was a flicker of hesitation in his stance. "You think one man's gonna stop us?" he scoffed, shifting slightly, fingers twitching toward his belt. Ethan didn't move, but his finger hovered near the trigger. "I'm not alone." As if on cue, a deep, rumbling growl echoed through the trees, low, guttural, primal, the kind of sound that turned blood to ice. The men stiffened, their confidence wavering. Ethan didn't need to turn to know what they saw. A shadow among the trees, massive, watching, waiting. Shadow had arrived. The bear emerged from the tree line, his dark form stark against the snow, his heavy paws pressing into the frozen ground without a sound. His eyes locked onto the poachers, unblinking, unwavering, filled with something ancient and deadly. The men froze. Shadow didn't charge, didn't roar. He didn't need to. His presence alone was enough. The scarred man's throat bobbed as he swallowed, his bravado crumbling. You trained that thing?" Ethan let the silence hang before speaking. "He's not trained. He's wild, and he's decided he doesn't like you." The younger poacher took a step back, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cold. "This ain't worth it," he muttered. "We should go." The scarred man hesitated, but the sight of Shadow, muscles coiled beneath thick fur, convinced him. Without another word, he turned, motioning for the others to follow. They backed away slowly, their rifles now feeling useless in the face of something they couldn't control. Ethan watched as they disappeared into the trees, the sound of their hurried retreat fading into the distance. He didn't lower his rifle until he was sure they were gone. Only then did he turn to Shadow. The bear stood where he had emerged, watching Ethan with those same knowing eyes. The bleeding from his paw had slowed, but he still favored it slightly, the injury fresh but not fatal. Ethan exhaled and, in a quiet gesture of understanding, gave the bear a small nod. "Looks like we make a good team," he murmured. Shadow didn't move for a long moment, then slowly he turned, lumbering back toward the depths of the forest. He didn't look back, but Ethan knew Shadow would always be watching. The forest had returned to silence, the kind that stretched endlessly beneath the weight of the falling snow. Ethan stood for a long time, his breath curling in the cold air, eyes fixed on the space where the poachers had disappeared. He had dealt with men like them before, men who saw the land as nothing more than something to take from, something to conquer. He knew better. The wilderness had never belonged to man. It was older, wilder, untamed, and it belonged to itself. Shadow had understood that. The bear had stood with him, not as a trained ally, not as a domesticated creature following orders, but as something else entirely, a guardian perhaps, a force that had simply decided in that moment to stand by him rather than against him. The weight of that understanding settled deep in Ethan's bones as he turned, beginning the slow walk back to his cabin. Each step felt heavier, the exhaustion of the day finally creeping in now that the adrenaline had faded. His boots crunched through the snow, following a familiar path through the trees. He knew the poachers would be back. He had seen the look in their eyes, not just fear, but something more dangerous. Greed, resentment, a need to prove that they were not the ones who had been forced to retreat. Men like that did not take humiliation lightly. He would have to be ready. The cold wind howled through the trees as he stepped onto the porch of his cabin, shaking loose a fine dusting of snow from the wooden beams. The fire inside had burned low again, casting long shadows across the small space as he stepped through the door. He set his rifle down carefully, stripping off his coat, his movements slow, deliberate. He needed rest, but his mind would not quiet. He paced for a moment, staring out the window, watching the dark tree line beyond the clearing. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, something waiting just beyond sight. He turned away, rubbing a hand over his face. Maybe he was imagining things. Maybe the tension of the day had left him seeing threats where there were none. But even as he tried to push the thought aside, he found himself glancing toward the door, his instincts refusing to settle. It was then that he heard it, a soft, deliberate sound just beyond the cabin walls. Not the wind, not the creaking of the old wood settling. Something else. Ethan stilled, every muscle going taut. He moved silently, years of training kicking in as he reached for his rifle. He didn't turn on the lights. He didn't make a sound. Instead, he stepped toward the window, angling his head just enough to peer outside. Camo. First, he saw nothing. Just the trees, the snow, the stillness of the night. But then, a shift, a movement near the tree line, a dark shape almost blending into the shadows. Ethan's breath hitched slightly. Shadow. The bear stood just beyond the clearing, massive and unmoving, his dark eyes reflecting the weak glow of the moonlight. He wasn't approaching, wasn't pacing, just watching, waiting. For what? Ethan wasn't sure. He stepped away from the window, running a hand through his hair, exhaling slowly. He wasn't afraid, at least not of Shadow. If the bear wanted to harm him, he would have done so long ago. No, this was something else. A presence, a lingering sense of something unfinished. Ethan didn't question it. He simply accepted it. The way he had accepted the way the wind carved patterns in the snow, or the way the river continued to flow beneath its frozen surface. Some things were simply meant to be. He banked the fire, settling onto the edge of his cot, the warmth finally beginning to seep into his tired limbs. He wasn't sure how long he sat there, staring at the flickering embers, before his eyes grew heavy. Sleep took him slowly, pulling him under. The image of Shadow still burned into his mind. The night passed in a haze of half-formed dreams, fragmented images of dark forests and deep growls, of heavy paws treading silently through the snow. When he woke, the first light of dawn was breaking over the horizon, washing the cabin in a soft, pale glow. He pushed himself up, rolling his shoulders to shake off the stiffness, his mind already shifting back to reality. He needed to check the perimeter. He needed to make sure the poachers had truly left. He moved quickly, dressing in warm layers, grabbing his rifle once more. The air outside was sharp, the kind that bit at the skin and forced wakefulness upon even the most exhausted of men. He scanned the clearing first, then the tree line. No sign of Shadow, no sign of anything. But as he moved toward the forest, something caught his eye. Tracks, fresh ones. Ethan followed them, his pulse quickening slightly. These weren't the same as the ones he had seen before. These weren't from a bear. These were from boots. He crouched, running a gloved hand over the disturbed snow. The pattern was familiar. Too familiar. His stomach twisted. The poachers had come back, and worse, they had been close, closer than before. He stood scanning the trees, tension coiling in his gut. They had been here, maybe even watching the cabin while he slept. The thought sent a ripple of unease through him, but he pushed it down, focusing instead on the next step. He needed to find them before they found him. He followed the tracks deeper into the woods, moving carefully, every sense on high alert. The forest was silent, unnervingly so, as if it too was waiting for something to happen. Then up ahead, something glinted in the morning light. Ethan narrowed his eyes, stepping forward cautiously. A trap, set and waiting. His jaw tightened as he examined it. They hadn't just come back. They had set up shop, and that meant they weren't planning on leaving anytime soon. His fingers curled around the mechanism, disarming it with practiced ease. He moved on, finding another one not far off, then another. They had scattered them throughout the area, a web of death waiting for anything unlucky enough to stumble into it. And Ethan knew, with a certainty that settled deep into his bones, that this was only the beginning. He straightened, scanning the trees once more. If the poachers wanted a fight, they had found one. And this time, he wasn't going to let them walk away. Ethan's breath curled in the frigid morning air as he crouched by the third trap, his fingers working quickly to disarm the rusted metal jaws that had been waiting, silent and cruel, beneath a light dusting of snow. His movements were precise, fueled by years of experience and an anger that had been simmering since the night before. The poachers had not only returned, they had escalated. They had set these traps close, far too close to his land, to Shadow's territory. This wasn't just greed anymore. It was a challenge, a declaration that they were not done, that they would not be driven away so easily. Ethan had spent his life respecting the balance of these woods, protecting it from men like them, and he wasn't about to stop now. He set the disabled trap aside, marking its location in his mind before moving on, his boots making soft imprints in the snow. The wind had begun to shift, carrying with it the faintest scent of something metallic, something out of place. Blood. Ethan's pulse quickened. He moved faster, his rifle held firm but low, his breath steady despite the tension knotting in his chest. The tracks led deeper into the forest, past the frozen creek, past the old ridge where the land dipped downward into a valley of pines. He followed them without hesitation, his senses sharp, every sound amplified by the quiet hush of the snowfall. Then he saw it, a disturbance in the snow, a struggle, blood smeared against the white. Not a large pool, but enough to tell him that something had fought here, something had been wounded. His eyes swept the ground, and there, half buried beneath the branches of a fallen tree, was a rifle. Not his. The realization sent a jolt through him. One of the poachers had lost their weapon. That meant they had been caught off guard. That meant something had gone wrong for them. His gut told him what he already suspected before he even saw the tracks leading away, heavy and erratic, deeper into the trees. Shadow had found them first. A grim satisfaction settled over him as he followed the trail, moving quickly now, his boots crunching through the snow, his grip tightening on his own rifle. The further he walked, the clearer the signs of struggle became. Branches snapped, deep furrows in the snow where something large had moved, pressed hard against the earth. He imagined the scene in his mind. The poachers had been laying their traps, confident, careless. They hadn't expected the bear to find them first. But Shadow was no ordinary bear. He was smart. He had been watching, waiting. The trail led to a small clearing where the remnants of a campsite sat abandoned. A fire had been smothered hastily, footprints scattered in chaotic patterns, but there was no sign of the men themselves. Only the thick, clawed prints of something much larger, something that had stalked these grounds before and claimed them as its own. Ethan exhaled slowly, scanning the area. There, just beyond the broken line of trees, the faintest movement. He raised his rifle, stepping forward with careful, measured steps, each one deliberate, controlled. The figure came into view, a man slumped against the base of a tree, his leg bent awkwardly, his breath ragged and shallow. Blood seeped into the snow beneath him, staining it dark, and his eyes snapped up at the sound of Ethan's approach. Fear, pure, raw, unmistakable fear. "Help!" the man rasped, his voice barely carrying over the wind. Ethan didn't lower his rifle. He took another step, his eyes flicking over the man's injuries. Claw marks along his leg, deep but not fatal. Shadow had struck him, but not killed him. A warning, a show of mercy. Ethan crouched a few feet away, keeping his rifle trained. "Where are the others?" The man swallowed, his face pale with pain, with something else, humiliation. "Gone," he managed. "Ran." Ethan studied him for a long moment, the weight of the situation settling over him like the snowfall that gathered in his hair. He could leave the man here, let the cold finish what Shadow had started. It would be easy, justified even. But Ethan had spent too many years upholding the laws of this land to break them now. "You're coming with me," he said finally, his voice as cold as the wind that howled through the trees. "You'll answer for what you've done." The man didn't argue. He couldn't. Ethan slung his rifle over his shoulder, stepping forward to haul the poacher to his feet, ignoring the pained hiss that escaped through clenched teeth. It was a long, slow walk back, but Ethan didn't rush. The land had a way of correcting itself, of making sure those who disrespected it paid their price. He had no doubt that the others, the ones who had fled, would not return. The fear of Shadow would keep them away. And if it didn't, Ethan would. By the time he reached the cabin, the sky had begun to shift, the gray clouds parting just enough for the first hints of sunlight to filter through. He shoved the poacher inside, securing him in a chair, then stepped back out onto the porch, taking a long breath of the crisp winter air. The woods were silent once more. The balance had been restored. And then, just at the edge of the tree line, he saw it. A dark shape, barely visible between the trees. Watching, waiting. Ethan didn't move. He didn't need to. He simply stood there, letting the understanding settle between them, letting the quiet acknowledgement pass through the distance. Shadow was still there, still guarding, still free. And as the wind carried away the last traces of conflict, Ethan knew without a doubt that he always would be.